Gabriel for hosting this and inviting me to talk. I hope my voice lasts through the talk because I've been fighting a little bit of a cough. So I guess I was introduced to libertarianism through the gateway of the marijuana. And,
the marijuana?
That's kind of all I remember about that. That's also why I need notes to kind of keep me on track. So just so I kind of get an idea of crowd, how many people here have heard about Bitcoin before? Okay, most of you. Nice. How many of you actually own Bitcoins?
As of a couple days ago, thanks to Mitch and Jackson for their first donations.
Nice. Okay, so a few. So I'm going to try and make this somewhat general, but also technical, and see if I can straddle that line somehow. So I kind of got interested in Bitcoin a few years ago, mainly with my concerns about the existing financial system, corruption, the shift of power from individuals to a very small and concentrated group. But I have to admit, when I first heard about Bitcoin, I was pretty skeptical, and it took me some time to read about it. I kind of came from Austrian school, and sort of gold and silver and something tangible had to be money. But I was also a programmer and really had an interest in networks and how networks can revolutionize the way we do things. So with Bitcoin, I got to reading about it and understanding sort of the inner workings, and so it took some time before I had my aha moment and really started to understand how this can really change the way we all exchange with each other. So yeah, I mean, what is Bitcoin? It's a decentralized digital currency. It's free market, open source, has a limited supply and almost infinite divisibility. So,
Can you show us some Bitcoins?
no. Maybe we can print some of those, I'm not sure.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, so actually I want to kind of go over the stated purpose of Bitcoin, which was to create a decentralized approach to value exchange. And the creator or creators stated that there's a bunch of problems with the centralized model. And kind of the biggest one to address is the issue of trust. So with a centralized model, you have to trust a central organization, central bank, to issue the currency and not abuse that power. You also have to trust banks to verify transactions, to store your wealth, and then you're also dependent on them to secure your wealth and prevent fraud and identity theft and these kinds of things. So, but as I think a lot of us here are aware, central banks aren't generally trustworthy. They tend to debase the currency, they're influenced by politics, they send the money to their friends, and banks themselves will loan out money, they'll keep a fraction of your money in reserve, and they influence bubbles and create all sorts of distortions in the market. And they also have a large overhead because they're a central organization trying to secure against identity theft and fraud and theft. So Bitcoin comes in and says, can we solve some of these drawbacks with a decentralized approach? And it's kind of an interesting proposition. So the way Bitcoin addresses these shortfalls is by setting up a system where the rules are made in advance. So there's a limited supply, the rate of inflation is predictable, all of the technical details are hammered out in a protocol that everyone's aware of, okay? So there's no going to the whims of some individual or some small group. Politics can't really influence the way Bitcoin is issued or transferred. and also the issue of transaction validation is handled a little bit differently. So instead of having one trusted central place where everything is validated, we use a peer-to-peer system. So everybody has a record of the transactions that have taken place, so they can verify if somebody actually owns those bitcoins and if they have the ability to send them to somebody else. So,
How's everyone has a record?
sorry?
Everyone has a record of every single Bitcoin
Of all of the transactions
that have ever happened.
that have ever happened. Now, you don't have to, but if you, say, download the client, you'll actually download a record of all the transactions. So if somebody sends you bitcoins, you can check whether they actually have a right to those bitcoins.
What happens if different groups disagree?
Okay, so we'll get into a little of that. I'll save some time for questions because usually there's
Sorry.
a lot of questions. So this kind of results, at least the idea is, in a distributed system where there's no central weakness or point of failure. So you might think of some other alternative currency systems like e-gold or web money. There's been a few anyways that have been attacked, Liberty Dollar, and these basically have one central place that a party like the government could come and attack, where this isn't true with Bitcoin. So it gets around that problem as well. So a little bit of history. So Bitcoin was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto. This is just a pseudonym, could have been a group of people, could have been one person, nobody really knows for sure. And so the first Bitcoins were generated 2009, January, and kind of grew slowly, and the next kind of real milestone was in May of 2010, where we had the first tangible transaction, where somebody made an offer of 10,000 Bitcoins to somebody that could deliver some pizzas, about $25 worth. So if anybody's interested in, say, regression theorem, this is kind of a good milestone to think about. So
that'd be worth.
how much would that 10,000 Bitcoins be worth? 10,000 times 25, $250,000. At the time, so the guy paid, so it was about a quarter of a cent for Bitcoin. Right now they're 25 approximately. So continued to kind of gain some popularity. In February of 2011, Bitcoin reached parity with the US dollar. So that was a pretty big milestone. A couple months later, it surpassed the euro and pound sterling. And a couple months later, things started going totally nuts. In June 2011, Bitcoin reached 10 US dollars. 4 days later, it peaked out at $32. Another 4 days later, it dropped back down to $10. And in the week that followed, there was all sorts of chaos. So there was a lot of reports of people's Bitcoins being stolen. The biggest exchange was hacked. The database was leaked. People logged in and made fake transactions, basically clearing out the system. And they were forced to shut down for 10 days. This is the biggest exchange, and I think they had probably 90% of the volume at the time. So after this, the price continued to go down, and it kind of bottomed out around $3. Although, if you think about it, over that 6 months or so, value actually increased 300%, from $1 to $3. There was a massive spike, and it was pretty crazy if you think about it. There's nothing really to justify that spike. So, but anyways, price came down and continued along. A lot of people thought this was the end, and this is sort of the death of Bitcoin. But plugged away, and then for the first half of 2012, kind of stabilized. So we had $5 US for that 6 months period. And then things started picking up a little bit. In November, the reward for mining Bitcoins, which we'll talk about a little bit, was cut in half. And then in December of last year, the first organization was granted payment service provider status in Europe, which is basically the same status as a bank. You just can't issue credit or loans. So this was kind of a nice sign of a growing mainstream acceptance of Bitcoin. And that brings us to today, where the last month Bitcoin has been growing very quickly, and we're sitting at about $24 US. So a little earlier on, I kind of made a claim that Bitcoin can do what the existing financial system does in terms of transactions and security without the centralized problem of corruption, abuse, and lack of transparency. So I want to kind of explain a little bit, this is kind of where the technical part comes in, of how Bitcoin does this. So Bitcoin is kind of two things that play together. There's a public ledger, which I kind of touched on, and a protocol. So a public ledger is just a list of all the previous transactions. You can verify transactions. And a protocol is really just a set of rules or procedures for how people have to interact in a certain network. So you're all probably familiar with the HTTP protocol, which governs how data is transferred on the internet, right? So these rules are set up in advance, and you have to agree to them voluntarily in order to interact on a network. So there's nobody that owns the protocol. Everybody has to choose to play by the protocol's rules voluntarily. You can't just go and change the protocol because nobody else is forced to accept it. You can maybe make a change, or a group can propose a change, but it depends upon the acceptance of the entire network. So it's kind of like you can have Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, your iPhone, Android, BlackBerry. These can all access websites because they all agree to the same set of rules. And it's not really easy to change those rules. So what are the rules that Bitcoin specifies? So the first one is limited supply, which is really important if you want something dependable and you know that your money's not going to be debased. So Bitcoin only allows 21 million units to ever exist. Now these units can be subdivided into 100 million smaller units called satoshis. And this could be subdivided further, but that gives you about 2.5 quadrillion units to play with. So there's not really any immediate threat of needing to make any smaller digits. So Bitcoins are generated through a process called mining. And mining is basically a process of verifying all of the previous transactions. So if you have some Bitcoins and you want to send them to somebody, what you do is you broadcast that you want to send. So you specify where you got your Bitcoins and who you want to send them to. Okay? So with the public ledger, anybody can verify that where you got them is legitimate. And so now there's a record of who owns them afterwards. So mining is a process of doing that, but you also have to solve a complex mathematical problem. And something that you can only do with brute force. You can only try one solution and see if it matches, but you can't really predict. So you have to change one of the variables continuously until you find an answer. Okay? So this kind of introduces energy, or you have to put in something in order to mine. So you need computer hardware and you need electricity. So there's a real investment required to extract Bitcoins. So miners kind of pool all the previous transactions into something called a block. Okay? So they have to verify and they have to solve this equation. And anybody that's trying to mine is competing to solve that equation first. Okay? So the first person to solve that equation gets rewarded with bitcoins. So they've successfully mined them. So, and once you find a solution, everybody else can verify the math to see that it's a valid solution. So far, if you think about it, you might say, well, okay, why don't I just add 100 computers and mine this faster, speed up the inflation, just keep adding on more computing power. And so the way this is solved is protocol, again, makes a rule. And the rule is that a new solution should only be found every 10 minutes. Okay? So every about 2 weeks, protocol checks how many bitcoins have been produced in the last 2 weeks. And it has a certain amount it expects. Okay? So if the Bitcoin protocol expects 500 bitcoins to be produced, and 700 have been produced, it says, okay, we need to make the math problem a little harder. So it needs to adjust. So it adjusts the difficulty of the math problem in order to account for the increase in computing power. And the opposite is true if not enough were produced. So it kind of has this self-regulating mechanism in order to prevent speeding up the inflation rate. And so this kind of ensures you have a stable, consistent supply of bitcoins at a very predictable rate, as opposed to, say, deciding to print however much money this month, next month, so everybody is aware of what's happening. So, skip that. So the current reward for doing this fancy mathematical problem is 25 bitcoins. It first was 50, and the protocol specifies that every 4 years this number is cut in half. So you can kind of think of it like actual mining, because when you're extracting minerals from the earth, the easy ones that are close to the surface take less energy and they're extracted quicker. The stuff that's deeper down, maybe out in the ocean, it's more difficult. That comes later, it needs more time, it needs more energy. So in this way, Bitcoin is trying to simulate that real-world mining problem. So we've actually mined already the first 50% of all the Bitcoins. In the next 4 years, it'll be 75%. And this will continue to be halved. And actually, all of the Bitcoins won't be mined until the year 2140. So that's quite a ways away. There's usually some pretty common questions about this. So a lot of people say, okay, I have my Bitcoins. They might be a little bit, unsure about security of computers, etc. So is it secure? Can I store a lot of Bitcoins? And I mean, it's kind of like any asset, because you have to, like your online banking, you have to protect your password. You have to, you're going to want to make sure nobody's spying on your computer. So you have to protect that information. The same is true for Bitcoin. So if you have a lot of assets in Bitcoin, you need to take steps to protect them with security measures. And there's ways you can do this that are very secure. You can be 100% sure that nobody has pried any eyes on your password or your encryption. So any asset needs some grade of security that is up to you. And Bitcoin kind of puts the responsibility of securing it onto yourself. Is action secure? Can there be fraud? And that kind of idea. And so it's been running for about 4 years. One of the largest payment processors is called BitPay, and they recently published that they had processed their first 10,000 transactions, and they had 0 incidences of fraud. So okay, that seems kind of impressive. I mean, if you compare it to credit card transactions, on a global level, 1 in 50 global credit card transactions is fraudulent. So compared with credit cards, that's a substantial difference. And that cost is really passed on to everybody. I mean, that fraud is real wealth that's being stolen from somebody. So the credit card or the bank eats that, right? But they charge fees, they charge interest, they make the merchants pay a processing fee. So the merchants get hit with this, and the merchants are not stupid. They calculate those payments and they include it in the price of the goods. So even if you don't pay any bank fees, if you don't pay any interest, you're still paying for the insecure nature of credit card transactions in the price of the goods. So that's kind of really something to keep in mind. So another question that's pretty common. Actually, I forget. Okay, is it stable? So I kind of probably scared you all with this 4 days. It shot up to $30 and it crashed. Yeah, it's a little unstable because it's a young it's a young system. I mean, compared to other monetary systems, it has a fairly small user base. But I mean, what I could say is it's existed for 4 years. It's had a few crises, but it's still kind of held its own. And the user base is increasing. The number of transactions, peer-to-peer, is increasing. And it's come back from this crash where people thought it was dead. So there's a lot still to be proved, but I think its resiliency is really starting to show, and has come back so quickly and has really silenced a lot of the earlier critics during that time. Yeah, and also the Bitcoin network hasn't been compromised. So, I mentioned the exchange was compromised. Sure.
What are Bitcoin's failings?
Sorry.
What are Bitcoin's failings?
What are their failings?
Yeah, it addresses a number of problems with traditional currencies, but I'm sure
Sure.
its method creates new problems.
Sure.
What are they?
I'll maybe get to that. I'm almost actually finished.
Okay.
I'll get to that right after. So far it hasn't been compromised, and it really isn't showing any signs of failure yet. But individuals have set up websites, they've had bitcoins, and they've been hacked and compromised. But this is more a failure of a young market with young, maybe inexperienced people that didn't take proper security procedures. And also, what can you do with it? I mean, the market's pretty small. On a global scale, you can buy books, magazines, clothes, electronics, web hosting, professional services, coffee, gold and silver. There's a lot of things. What's that?
Silk Road.
Silk Road, yeah, you can buy your favorite flavor of Kush. There's a lot of things that you can do online gambling. I think one of its bigger draws at the moment anyways, because it's a pretty small market. Like in Vancouver, we have a couple places. You can get a massage here, you can get some coffee as well. But, compared to the whole market, it's pretty small.
There's a place in Berlin, kind of like a neighborhood in Berlin.
Okay.
That just in November they launched a campaign that the entire neighborhood would accept it,
Yeah.
everything, like whether you go to a restaurant, haircuts, white clothes, whatever. And that's actually what happened.
Do you know if it's gaining any traction or?
I haven't checked into it recently.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. But one of the advantages is, I think, getting around huge monopoly and bureaucracy with sending payments. For instance, if you want to send money halfway around the world and you want to avoid, say, Western Union or wire transfer fees, or say a limit of $10,000 so that you're not flagged as a money laundering drug dealer, Bitcoin can really do this instantly with almost no transaction fees. So I think that's a really big draw. And then if you want to exchange back into a traditional currency, you can do so at a much lower rate than you would with a bank. And in the States, that's not really true for us. You can get around the gambling laws, which is quite nice. So a lot of the Bitcoin casinos are doing well just because they're allowing Americans to gamble online. So, last question, I guess. People would wonder where can you get it? I mean, you could try mining, which is like, you know, the process I stated earlier. You could also just sell something or take donations, and people can send you something in exchange. You can do like a peer-to-peer network. So there's something called local bitcoins, where people around the city will meet you and exchange person to person. And actually, in Vancouver, there's a group that's Vancouver specific for that. And if you want to see Joshua over there. Jackson. So you run something called it's part of Van BTC, where they do person-to-person transactions. And or you can go to an exchange where you transfer your funds, and then you can bid on the live market for bitcoins. And that's kind of what I'm involved in. I recently started my own exchange. So if you're interested in that, you can come and see me. And so yeah, that's kind of it. So I think I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Dan. So Dan was asking, are there any new problems? Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends compared to what. So one of the problems actually when I was talking with Katie is you're really tied to the internet or you know, the digital world. Like what if power goes out? What if the internet gets knocked down? That kind of thing. So you do have a risk in terms of the infrastructure that you're dependent on. So Bitcoin really depends on the internet and electrical infrastructure being sound. And if that goes down, you really don't want to depend on Bitcoin, on maybe food or rice or gold. Some other problems, I mean, there are some risks. I mean, I think there's some vulnerability from attack. So if, say, a government feels very threatened by Bitcoin, they may try to take over part of the network, maybe dominate the mining, and they can try and sabotage it this way. So Bitcoin is kind of based on game theory. So there's not really much to be gained if you try and compromise or take over the network, because it's very transparent, and people will see that some rogue group is trying to dominate the network, and it may lower the value. So you don't gain much by trying to attack it. But if you have no interest in gaining value from Bitcoins, you can try and do an attack with computing power, and you're using other people's money, which is tax money. So I see there is a vulnerability there, although there may be ways to address that because the protocol can be modified, and maybe if you know who is attacking, to block those sort of entity. But that is definitely a weakness, I think, depending on the size, especially since it's so small right now.
It's still the world's biggest distributed
Yes,
network.
it's the biggest distributed computing network, though with a few $100 billion, I suppose you could try and mount an attack, but I think there would be enough time to try and mitigate the problem.
What happens if the network splits in pieces?
If the network splits?
It's PP network, right?
Yes.
So what happens if the other parts will separate out?
Yeah, that's possible. So if say like two groups kind of try to change the protocol.
Just for whatever reason, right? You have
Yeah.
two-person network for separate, they can't connect, and you have people mining, and they get the same, mine coins or whatever.
Right.
And then it joins up later, well, whose coin is it?
So the way this is solved is with basically when you try and merge two blocks, the protocol tries to check which one is longer, or which one, longer is kind of a bad term, but which one had the most difficulty. So it kind of prevents somebody trying to create a really simple Bitcoin problem and solving a bunch of them. So that wouldn't be considered longer. It would check the difficulty of the blocks that were solved, and the one that was most difficult becomes the accepted one.
So is it based on the time when it got solved?
Yes. So that would be the first person.
How do you
gets
guarantee? How do you guarantee that I'm not lying all the time when I solve it? Like, say I did all this solving back when someone else did it too, and I saved it for later. I'm like, oh, and now it just flooded. Oh, I solved it just now.
What do you mean you did all this
Okay,
solving?
So you have, like, say, like a year ago, people were trying to solve the points, right? And you were doing some really complex stuff, but other people did more complex stuff and beat you too. So you can lose them then. So why can't I just take them, now it's a year later, just like when there's this, whatever, the mining, you just dump them all and say, oh, look, I solved all these now.
Yeah, but see, the problem is everybody's trying to solve the same problem. So you can't go off and solve your own problem,
specific
and say,
problem.
right? So everybody's kind of working on the same thing. They just have a different input. So they have a different number that they start their sort of try and their brute force solution.
Do you know what the problem you're trying to solve is?
Yeah, it's a hashing algorithm. I don't know if you're.
I'm a computer science background.
Okay, so basically you're trying to hash all the inputs, which is the transactions,
Yeah.
and your output hash
Yeah.
has to have a certain pattern. So you need a certain number of zeros to begin a hash. So it uses the SHA 256
Yeah.
hashing algorithm. So your hash has to match a certain number of zeros. And the difficulty is modified by altering the number of zeros.
So when you say the inputs,
Right.
what are the inputs?
So there's the list of the transactions. So transactions have IDs.
Yeah.
And also inputs is who the miner is. The miner has an address as well, so that's a unique value. And then there's an auto increment value that's sort of a variable that you use to try and generate the hash.
Yeah.
So if somebody solves this, they have to send what their initial inputs were
Yeah.
and their solution. So then everybody else can verify whether they've actually solved this successfully.
So you just concatenate them on SHA one?
So it's actually SHA twice, and then the inputs is sort of it's a text representation of the transactions.
I have a question. How do you use it in like a more mobile setting? Where if you're trying to go get a haircut or something like that.
Sure. I mean, for that you probably need something like a mobile phone, right? So there's actually a lot of mobile wallets. And actually, if anybody here wants to just set up a Bitcoin wallet like instantly, just go to instawallet.org, and you'll get an address, and you can say, please send your Bitcoins here, and it will tell you when those Bitcoins arrive. So that would be a case that you could do something on the go. There are some people doing like physical representations of Bitcoin, like kind of scratch cards almost. Although you have to make sure you trust that party that they haven't kept that information for themselves, can't access it later on. So that would be how you do it mobily.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hey, so when I'm understanding Bitcoins, the nature of the transaction is very basic. It's you and I make a deal.
Right.
It's not one to many. It's not an investment. It's something that I can verify with anything. It's like one-to-one transaction.
By one-to-one, you mean between you and me?
Yeah.
Well, sort of. I mean, like if I have a bunch of Bitcoins, they may have come from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah, but I don't care.
Right.
So if the transactions are very basic. If you want a beer, I'll sell you one for 5 Bitcoin.
Yes, yes.
It's not like, oh, so you're building a company. If I invest 50,000 Bitcoins, I have an ownership stake.
Right, right. Yeah, so on the surface level, it's very simple. I'm sending X amount of Bitcoins to your address, and
So it's going, it's like, very fun.
yes,
Can
yes.
I jump in there?
Sure.
That's actually part of what our company does, is like what you're talking about is kind of really a contract. So instead of just a financial transaction, like contracts are, transaction is a contract. Special cases, financial transactions. And a subset of financial transactions would be this simple contract that you're talking about. So what our company does is we have a system for generalized legal transactions, which includes all kinds of financial transactions, whether that is stock markets or like a legal contract that doesn't involve money, or annuities that go like every month, or conditional things, or escrow. Basically anything that a human can dream of that you can put in a contract today, you can do with this system. But it builds on Bitcoin, so Bitcoin is kind of like a base and a core technology that enables a lot of very cool things. And now a lot of people are using that and extending it in all kinds of directions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, I was just wondering if a network's been compromised, can you actually use stolen bitcoins if you can see the public ledger of where they came from?
So how do you mean
Well-
compromise?
Well, you said there was a network that was compromised and exchanged.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was their own like database,
Right.
So, and they had a wallet as well. But the main problem with them was actually their database compromised. So all of their user information, emails, hashed passwords, and actually a few accounts were broken into, so people made transactions under somebody else's name.
Right.
But the ledger still continued. That didn't affect the past transactions. That was really an isolated problem for their own personal database of information, not the Bitcoin network's information. I think.
I just want to say, like, if you could hack the Bitcoin network, has never been hacked. If you could hack the Bitcoin network, you would have already been able to hack everything in the world. So,
Why are they the same?
it's the message of encryption.
It's no worse. In other words, it's no worse than the current.
It's the same kind of encryption that the current banking system uses. I think somebody was.
Yeah, my question is more about a long-term problem with bitcoins.
Okay.
Like the way you mine, like you use computer power to find prime numbers to solve the security question. But what will happen when quantum computing will kick in like 20 years or 30 years?
Sure, I think it's kind of similar. So I mean, that's going to be a problem for.
Because then, if let's say I'm very evil and I want to mine all the bitcoins, I'll just have my quantum computer plug it into the system and then take all the money.
Right. So
Is
yes.
SHA one of the fundamental prime numbers?
Oh, it's not a prime number.
No, I'm asking because the quantum computer thing only affects encryption protocols that work on almost prime numbers. So
But I think it
two
does.
large prime numbers multiplied with each other.
Yeah, I think
Double
but
busted by quantum.
but it does. Like that's what I read about.
Okay.
And the problem is that for those who don't know that, like with quantum computing, it's just like that. Like there'll be no effort. So
It's layer time.
Sure. So I mean, that's going to be a problem for everybody in the financial world. I mean, if you can do that, that's going to be a larger scale problem than just the Bitcoin network. So that part can actually be modified, and the assumption is that a new method of mining will be introduced
yeah.
when that is a serious threat. So that is kind of up in the air. Right now, there's not really any,
But they should.
at least to our knowledge, that.
But the people who aren't like you should already think about it.
Oh yeah.
Because it's good. Like once it's going to arrive, it's going to be a huge problem. Like,
Of course. So that's why the design of a good system is modular. So the whole infrastructure is actually independent of the particular algorithms. So you just like, for example, the SHA 256 one. There's theoretical attacks on it. They're not practical today, but there's theoretical ones on it. If they should be practical, then we just switch in a different algorithm that works. And so the whole system stays in place and continues.
Structure right now, and it used to be even freer, and it seems to be more kind of getting, a little concern about who's monitoring what, and there's even these things being proposed about traffic shaping, so that implies you're deciding based on who someone is, who gets the traffic, and da-da-da. Sure. So, I mean, yeah, it's P2P, but it's still running on this, it's a controlled internet in a sense. I mean, it's not controlled yet, but I mean, effectively it might as well, and it sounds like it's almost getting there, so how, is it gonna, you have to shift to like a, you know what I mean, like to a separate internet, or how do you isolate yourself from attacks, you know, like that, where you get shaped out of being able to, you denial of service or whatever?
Right. So because Bitcoin is sort of living on the internet, attack on the internet would also be sort of an attack
In a shaping kind of way. I mean, the internet can still run, meaning they haven't taken the whole system down, but they deny you service. You know?
Right, but I mean, if they deny me personally service, that doesn't really affect the rest of the network. I mean, yeah,
I didn't
I
mean you.
can't-
I meant it somehow bits or the Bitcoin service itself.
Sure.
It's shaped. Yeah.
I guess that's sort of the reason behind the peer-to-peer nature, right? So there's no real one place where you can attack. So it's a lot like if you think of BitTorrent, they shut down individual websites that host torrents, but the transaction can still continue based on the BitTorrent protocol. So you have to go after every single individual that lives on the network if you're, or a large part of that network in order to shut it down, because there isn't one place that's transferring that information.
And that shouldn't be too hard in the internet though, right? So they just, right now, most people are focused on financial and legal. They want to go after someone and get the mother with the kid who had 10,000 songs and all that,
Sure.
right? But I mean, once you get into more of the shaping kind of thing, you can just identify the addresses of people who are interacting with this, you know, this network, and then say, but rightly or wrongly, even they could shape it in their favor. Just say, well, you know, that's your problem now. You now have less internet access, whatever.
Sure. It is a problem, and it's kind of it takes going after a lot of people. You have to go after, determine all of the individuals that are living, and there's a lot of anonymizing services where people that are on the network actually mask their location, and it makes it very difficult to
It's
determine
a cat and mouse. Yeah.
where they're actually coming from. So you can take steps to avoid detection, as people on BitTorrent do,
Right.
so that the authorities or whoever's trying to shape or
Pure block or whatever that kind of.
yeah, or the
Yeah.
Tor network.
There are actually efforts underway now to build a completely alternate layer to the internet, kind of like the dark net, that direction. And these technologies cannot be stopped. Because the internet right now, even though it looks decentralized on the surface, and it is compared to what we have before, it's still relatively centralized. You have big nodes, and like if you go to the ISP, you can shut it down.
Yeah.
Like Egypt or Syria or whatever, Iran, they do that. So it's too centralized still. But there's new technologies, mesh networks, that are literally, you can't stop. Like, you'd have to go to 7 billion people, and how can you do that? Who's going to do that?
No, your company maybe. Your company's making solutions for it, right?
No, but what I mean is how do you, as law enforcement, go and control 7 billion people? It's just impossible.
Even in Egypt, when
There's not
they
enough resources to do it.
I shut down
I was
the
just saying
internet,
with the existing.
people still created mesh networks in Egypt and were able to reconnect to the outside world. So even when they tried to shut down all the internet in the country, people were still able to bypass that.
Just as one example, like currently the internet uses the DNS system. So what the governments are now doing is they don't like you, they just take your domain.
Yeah.
But there's an alternate system like CJDNS and other technologies that are completely decentralized. There's no ICANN organization that controls it. There's no organization. It's completely decentralized. They cannot stop it.
I read recently an article about how some of the Mexican drug cartels were kidnapping engineers to build their own private wireless network.
Okay. So let me see if I get this straight. In order for a transaction like to carry on between two people, there is for that transaction to take place, somebody has to solve a problem, and then the reward for that is an amount of bitcoins.
So when you send a transaction,
Right.
you don't have to solve the algorithm.
No.
All you do is you broadcast what you're doing to others on the network. So somebody pools all the transactions that have taken place since the last time. Or not all of them, they might
Okay.
select some.
Over a time period, these transactions are pooled,
Right.
and then somebody goes.
Somebody confirms it,
Ah,
so they
okay.
check those transactions. And they also, at the same time, they have to solve that mathematical problem.
Okay.
And if they do, once they've done both successfully, that gives them a reward.
So that's the incentive for actually making that process, the transaction,
Yes,
all those
for
transactions happen.
securing and verifying and offering that sort of
Okay.
the service.
So then as it gets towards 2040, now that only 10.5 million Bitcoins have been mined, leaving the other half to be mined, the incentive drops off.
Yes.
How will transactions take place if there's no incentive for anyone?
So it's 2140 when all Bitcoins will be exhausted. And after that, there is the ability to offer a transaction fee. And this is thought of as going to be a solution to that. So in the future, instead of miners being rewarded with new currency, they'll be rewarded with a transaction fee for sending something small. Because I mean, it's not free, right? You need energy, you need computing power. It's just a lot more economic than the way it's currently done.
Okay, and then I guess the exchange rate between US dollars or any other currency versus a Bitcoin, and that seems to fluctuate. How is that determined? Not in a LIBOR way.
The exchange rate?
Yeah, the exchange rate.
Well, there's basically different exchanges where people that have Bitcoins and people that want Bitcoins
So you can just
trade,
buy
like a stock
Bitcoins.
market, right?
Oh, okay, all right.
So that's where that price comes from. But that's just sort of approximation. Different markets might fluctuate.
Okay,
But that's where that price is determined.
okay. And then one last thing. Is the statement true or false? Bitcoin is a fiat currency.
No. False.
Okay. Why?
What would make it a...
Does it have any intrinsic value?
What do you mean by intrinsic value?
It's tangible. Like an ounce of gold is an ounce. Its weight is its value.
So,
Whereas Bitcoin is a string.
so value is really subjective. Something doesn't have intrinsic value in that sense. People give it value. And it gets that value because it has certain properties
Right.
that people want.
Economic value has trade value.
Right.
And because there's a certain cost that's invested in harvesting.
Sure, that's part of it. So,
Unlike quantitative easing or whatever, where they just invent money out of thin air.
right. So that would be an example
Must be
of
earned.
fiat. Sort of, it's created out of very arbitrarily. So it has properties that actually try to mimic gold in a digital sense, and its value reflects the people that use it, not some kind of, the price does not reflect some kind of inherent value that comes from people. Yeah.
People always say that about Bitcoin. It doesn't have any value, but that's its greatest weakness, but that's also its greatest strength. Because no one can shut it down. No government can come in and just stop it. It's also
Give us your gold.
It's a big strength.
It's lack of physical.
That is not tangible.
Does Bitcoin run on TCP or UDP?
Sorry, Dan.
Does Bitcoin run on TCP or UDP? The network.
Actually, I believe it's TCP, but
Is it
I have to check on that.
Is it fixed port or is it variable?
Is it a fixed port?
Is it like specific port, like HTTP is port 80?
So if you're running the Bitcoin client, you can actually modify that port.
So
So
client is, but notice, who do you connect to? Like, how do you join the network?
right, so this is actually I'm not too familiar with this, but there is like a standard port, but you have an option to connect to specific nodes instead. So you can actually modify that port if you want to connect to a particular group rather than
Well, I
having
was
to determine.
thinking if someone wanted to shut it down, they could just
Okay.
block the port.
They could just
They could just block that port. It's like an ISP said, oh, I don't want it.
right. So yeah, in that case, you'd want to modify the protocol
Yeah.
and change that port. So you have to again be a game of cat and mouse where you're trying to block the port, open the port. It's a little bit of a
And you said, well, we've improved the protocol, and who's injecting or controlling the protocol itself? Is that democratic in some kind of way, or is there sort of, like, that relates to trust too, right?
yes. So I mean, it's an open source project, so anybody can download the source and examine it themselves. So there is a group of developers that actively they add features. They've actually added things like escrow, moving this to the actual stock software. And so they do have, some method of accepting new developers, but all of their changes and publishings are put onto open source platforms, so anybody can see line by line what they've changed, where they changed it, when they've changed it. So there's a peer review by anybody that's
What
going
recourse, if people disagree, what recourse do they have?
Well, if you change something, nothing makes you download a new version, or nothing makes you change the client. So if they go and they say, okay, well, we want to change the protocol, and the miners or everybody else that's on the network disagrees with their changes, they don't have to implement that. And so those changes won't be accepted.
Yeah, but I don't understand all the laws in this country, right? So I can understand people wouldn't understand all the changes that a developer would make, so how would they be smart enough, quote unquote, to opt out?
Well, I mean, the bulk of the network is people that have a financial interest. So, for instance, miners have dedicated money and resources, electricity, into that network. So it's in their interest to monitor those changes and to see if anything, that they don't like takes place. The average person probably isn't going to go and look at the code. So there is some trust involved, and it depends on this kind of check and balance. But yeah, you could maybe think of some situation where somebody's fooled, or there's a big kind of large scam. But I find it quite difficult. The community is very active and very vocal about changes and proposals. But I see that as being very difficult to actually
It would come to light pretty quick.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Absolutely.
If anyone's got one more burning question on their minds, we can entertain that, but then we should probably move along.
Last question.
Okay, bear with me, I missed the very beginning. The actual Bitcoin, is it a string of characters? Is that what it is, or what is the?
It's a record on a public ledger, basically.
Okay, so if I'm the kind of guy that likes to put money under my mattress, can I move it to a thumb drive or something, or is there?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you can, basically what you want is you have a private key that allows you to spend the Bitcoins on your address.
Okay.
So this private key, I mean, you could put it on a piece of paper and put it in a lockbox and bury it in the forest somewhere. And then if you want to spend your Bitcoins, go dig it up and use
I
that
see.
key. So that would be one way of kind of doing that. Or you can do an encrypted, USB key or something of that sort. And there's some steps you can take to make sure you have a computer system that's never seen the internet, so nobody
Right.
could have logged, your typing or something of that kind of thing.
It's a good last
Okay,
question.
so then it's locked away, and I'm the only person that knows where it is.
But yeah,
Your address is all over the network though, right? It's just your key that accesses the address?
yes.
Okay.
So you might want to tell some family in case you get hit by a bus.
Well, I mean, I have to answer these questions, right?
Yeah. So yeah, you want to
If I get it.
maybe have multiple physical locations and have some
Who
real.
are you giving this money to? What are you getting for it?
Well, thanks very much,
Yeah,
Paul.
thanks,
Yeah,
man.
thank you.
Well, it sounds like we have more than just one person who knows what we're talking about on this subject here, so any more questions can be directed to them. But next up we have Dan here, who's got something that looks like it may be the love child of R2D2 and like junkyard or something. I don't know. It looks pretty fascinating, whatever it is. So he's going to explain how 3D printing works. Dan.